Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. And thank you for joining us today on a session which is a very important topic relating to the geopolitics in the Middle East. The developments in the region are crucial for India, not only due to our proximity, but also from the perspective of economics, politics, and energy. We have with us Professor Asher Susa, an expert on Middle Eastern history from the Tel Aviv University. Professor Susa is a renowned authority on the societies of the Middle East, as well as the political and security scenarios in the region. I have no doubt that you would have read his brief biography with the invite in today's event. But to introduce him more formally, Professor Susa is a Professor Emeritus of Middle Eastern History at Tel Aviv University. He was the director of the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Tel Aviv University for 12 years and has taught for over 35 years in Tel Aviv University's Department of Middle Eastern History. He's taught in several leading universities and has also published several books in his area of expertise. His online course on the emergence of the modern Middle East has been taken by more than 95,000 students in over 160 countries. We at Ananta Aspen today are also live streaming this, am I correct, Kiran? And so we hope to achieve those type of viewership numbers as well. Professor Susa, thank you very much for being with us here today. We discussed having you here for this session at our last forum meeting in December, and I'm very glad that we've been able to get you here. I know that you have a hectic schedule ahead of you with interactions earlier today, as well as tomorrow, but also in Pune and Chennai in the following days. Our partnership with Tel Aviv University goes back to 2007, when India and Israel relations were at a building stage. The Ananta Aspen Center has been at the center of some of the initiatives at the Track 2 level of building India and Israel relations. We have with us Mr. Tarun Das, who's been very key to the engagements, not only between the two countries at the Track 2 level, but also within the Ananta Aspen Center in terms of driving these initiatives forward. I'd also like to acknowledge Mr. Gary Sussman, who is at the core of a lot of the activities, along with Ms. Kiran Pasricha at the Ananta Center. I, of course, am very glad and honored to co-chair the Indo-Israel Forum, along with Mr. Jamshed Godrej from the Indian side. The forum has played a significant role in strengthening the India-Israel relations over the years, and the Ananta Aspen Center, Tel Aviv University, and CII can each take some credit in fostering relations between India and Israel and to the level at which they exist today. This has truly been an amazing partnership, and we are gratified by the many interactions, conversations, ideas, and friendships that our joint efforts have stimulated over the years. With these brief remarks, I now request Professor Susa to make his presentation. We look forward to having a fruitful discussion on the current trends and dynamics in the Middle East and how it impacts India and the world at large. Ladies and gentlemen, do join me in welcoming Professor Susa.
Well, good evening, and thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I must say it's a great pleasure for me to be back in India. I was here a few months ago, and I was here for the first time a few years ago. And it's always a great pleasure for me to be here, and thank you all for coming this evening. Speaking about Israel, the Arabs, and Iran, that is the focal points of the Middle East of the 21st century, is an effort to say that the Middle East of the 21st century is a very different place to that which it was for most of the 20th century. During the entire 20th century, people would refer to the Middle East and the Arab world as if they were one and the same thing. And people would say, you know, the Middle East is the Arab world and the Arab world is the Middle East, and that was accepted for 100 years and more. But it's simply not true anymore. The Arab countries that were the driving forces of Middle Eastern affairs for much of the 20th century are in very profound socio-economic political crisis. They are not the driving forces in the region anymore. And because of this decline of Arab influence and power, the major forces of Middle Eastern affairs and the driving forces of Middle Eastern affairs, and you can even gather this just from listening to the news from the Middle East, who the main players are. And the main players are three: Iran, Turkey, and Israel, none of which is an Arab state. There is not one single Arab state which is a driving force of Middle Eastern events. If you go back to the 1950s and the 1960s, it was all about Abdel Nasser. It was all about Egypt. It was all about Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia. And today, these are all countries in various levels of crisis, some of them even after a civil war like that of Syria, which has left the country in ruins. So how has this come about, and why has this come about? For the last 20 years or so, the UN has almost annually produced studies on the Arab world, which are called the Arab Human Development Reports. The Arab Human Development Reports, I'd like to emphasize, are reports that are written for the most part by Arab scholars working for the UN. It is not a study of the Arab world conducted by outsiders, by Europeans or Americans who may have some kind of bias towards the Arab world. And I mention that because these reports are pessimistic, critical. And if you had followed the reports over the last 15 years or so, you would understand very readily why the Arab Spring emerged. And the Arab Spring, I must say up front, was not an adventure in the advancement of democracy, as people may have wished it to be, but a reflection of a profound socio-economic crisis of an entire generation. That is what the Arab Spring was about. And it's not over yet. The Arab world, according to these development reports, suffers from three major deficits. And these deficits combine to create a backdrop for poorly performing economies. A lack of political freedom, the lack of first world education systems, and the lack of gender equality. The first two, the lack of political freedom and the lack of first world education systems, leads to the emergence of economies that are very poor performers in terms of innovation. These are economies that are not based on innovation that is the core of modern economies today. The lack of gender equality makes things only that much worse. A large percentage of the female population are not part of the workforce because it is not traditionally acceptable for women to work outside the home. So close to half the population doesn't work. If you have such a low participation of women and generally speaking in the workforce, you have poorly performing economies where women who in these kinds of societies also tend often to be less educated than men. You have a combination of poorly performing economies with rapidly growing populations. Women with lower levels of education tend to have more children than women who are better educated. This is not a Middle Eastern phenomenon, it's universal. This combination of poorly performing economies with rapidly growing populations is a prediction for disaster. But this is not a prediction, that's the sad story. We are there. We're in it. This is not about the future. We are in the disaster. That is the Arab Spring. Is the recognition, the very unfortunate recognition of an entire generation of people from the ages of 18 to 30 that they don't have a future to look for. Waiting out there for some opportunity to come by in terms of education or a good job, which is most unlikely for a very large proportion of the people of the Middle East. And as a result, a very pessimistic vision of these people's own expectations. So the Arab Spring is a reflection of this internal economic crisis for which, unfortunately, I cannot see any solution in the foreseeable future. The Arab population of the Middle Eastern countries has increased in the last 10 years by 100 million people. The population of all the Arab countries in 2000 was 280 million. It's now 420 million. In the 2020s, it'll be 460 million. Who's going to provide for these people? The population of Egypt grows by 2 million a year. It is now at the 100 million mark. This is a region as a result of these socio-economic dislocations, civil wars, refugees, and emigration. The region has 5.4% of the world's population, but 37% of the world's refugees. Oil is no longer a stabilizer of Middle Eastern economies. Prices have declined, and therefore the oil-rich countries are not as rich as they were, and they can't bail out their poorer brethren as they often did. Thus, the rise of the non-Arab powers. Now you could ask, why have Turkey and Iran been more successful? Why have they done better? And I think Turkey and Iran have done better, primarily because these are countries not newly created by imperial powers in the aftermath of the First World War. They were there long before. Turkey was the Ottoman Empire. Iran was an empire of its own. These are countries that have been in existence for centuries upon centuries, have a language of their own, are relatively speaking, religiously and linguistically cohesive. And as a result, as opposed to the newly created states like Syria and Iraq and others in the aftermath of the First World War, they have had a far longer statist tradition and have been also politically and economically more successful. Just to give an example of how weak the Arab states have become in determining the region, Syria has just gone through a civil war. Syria is now emerging from the civil war. And who are the countries determining the fate of Syria? Russia, Iran, and Turkey. The Arabs are not even asked. They are not even at the table. In the 1950s, just to accentuate the difference that has come about, in the 1950s, when Syria was very unstable and seemed to be falling apart, Syria fell into the lap of Egypt. Egypt took Syria over and united Egypt with Syria, creating what was then called the United Arab Republic. Syria simply fell into the lap of Egypt. Today, nobody even asks Egypt what to do about Syria. So the great hope of Arab nationalism, and this is linked in part to your own history. If you go back to the 1950s and the 1960s, the heyday of the non-aligned movement in the post-Second World War international politics, up on the stage in the primacy of international politics were people like Nehru, Tito from Yugoslavia, and Nasser of Egypt. Where is the Nasser of the Arab world today? Who is the Nasser of the Arab world today? There is none. Arab nationalism, as represented by Abdel Nasser, was supposed to provide the prosperity, the power, and the prestige of the Arabs as a great nation. But Arab nationalism was a political failure. Never really succeeded in doing what Abdel Nasser had hoped it to be, and what the Arabs who followed Abdel Nasser in their masses believed that Egypt of Abdel Nasser would in fact do. And all of this came to naught in a very humiliating fashion in the war against Israel in 1967, when Arab nationalism was exposed as an empty vessel. This has long-term ramifications. Arab nationalism is an idea that has European origins and is related to the massive influence of Europe in the Middle East of the 19th and 20th century. The idea that the people who speak the same language are a nation is a European idea. Germans speak German and have a country called Germany. And the French speak French and have a country called France. That is a European idea. The idea that the Arabs are a nation because they speak the same language is a novelty. People in the Middle East never defined themselves by the language they spoke. They defined themselves for centuries upon centuries by their religion. You were either a Muslim or something else. And if you were a Muslim, what kind of Muslim? And if a Christian, what kind of Christian? People defined themselves by their religion. Therefore, the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East was a legitimate empire. It wasn't a foreign empire of conquerors. The Ottoman Empire was a legitimate empire of Sunni Muslims, accepted by the Sunni Muslims of the Arab world. The fact that they spoke Turkish and the Arabs spoke Arabic was irrelevant. But in the advent of nationalism, Arab nationalism became this new modernizing movement. Arab nationalism is a secular idea. It unites the people on the basis of the language they speak, not on the basis of their religion. So Muslims and Christians alike who speak Arabic are Arabs. This was not just a secular idea, but the secularizing platform for the modernizing Arab world. Uniting under the banner of Arabism people on the basis of their language and not their religion. This was a way of marginalizing religion in politics. The failure of Arabism is the failure of this secularizing platform and the avenue to the rise of political Islam, reverting to Islamic identity, where the Islamists argued all the time that the Arab nationalists were wrong, and that Arab nationalism, this aircraft carrier of secularism, was bound to fail. And when it failed, the Muslim Brethren and their type could say, the only answer is Islam. Islam huwa al-hal. In Arabic, Islam is the solution, not some secular European idea, not the importation of ideas from foreigners, but back to ourselves. The problem is that if political Islam, then whose political Islam? Sunnah? Shia? Between the Sunnis and the Shiites, there are differences in the form of political Islam. There is a difference in doctrine, in dogma. The Sunnis emphasize the implementation of Islamic law, the implementation of the Sharia. A society is a just society if it is based on the Sharia. The Shiites also hold the
Sharia in high esteem, obviously, but they have a different emphasis. The Shia emphasize the character of the ruler. Wilayat al-faqih, that is, the country must be ruled by the jurisprudent. The country must be ruled by a man of religion. So the Shia emphasize the character of the ruler. The Sunnis emphasize the implementation of the law. There is no papacy in Islam. There is no Sunni pope. There is no single authority to define what the correct implementation of the Sharia is. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of organizations and militias who have their own avenue, their own version of what the implementation of the Sharia ought to be. And the Sunni world, therefore, is deeply divided within itself. The civil war in Syria was dozens of militias for and with each other and against each other at one and the same time. It very often looked like the Hobbesian war of all against all. The Shiite world is very united. United around the character of the ruler, the Ayatollah. The Ayatollah is in fact in power in Tehran. Not all Shiite men of religion will accept this idea of the Ayatollah, but most do. Shiis who live outside Iran look to Tehran as a source of authority. The Shia in Iraq, the Shia in Lebanon, even the Shia in Yemen, who are from a different branch of Shia. So in this return of political Islam, you have a deeply divided Sunni world versus a relatively united Shiite world under the auspices of a state, Iran. Iran, therefore, in the competition between the versions of political Islam and these competitions of dogma and doctrine, Iran has a built-in advantage. Now, if you add to that some of the more recent developments in politics, Iran's advantage becomes even more pronounced. The American war against Saddam Hussein in 2003. Saddam Hussein was a dictator, notorious for the cruelty of his regime. And in terms of the morality of things, it was right that he be removed. But Saddam's Iraq was also the gatekeeper to the Arab East against Iran. Removing Saddam removed the gatekeeper. As bad as Saddam's Iraq may have been, it is Saddam's Iraq that kept Iran out of the Eastern Arab world, the Arab East, the Mashriq as opposed to the Maghreb. By removing Saddam, by de-Ba'athifying Iraq, and the de-Ba'athification of Iraq in the American mind was a repetition of the denazification of Germany after the Second World War. The de-Ba'athification in the Iraqi case meant the disempowering of the Sunnis. The Ba'ath was the machine whereby the Sunni minority, the Sunni minority in Iraq ran Iraq. You kick out Saddam Hussein, you remove the Ba'ath party from the scene, you are empowering the Shiite majority in Iraq, which may be just, more democratic, but handing Iraq over to Iran. Iraq becomes this province of Iranian influence, of Shiite Iran next door. Now, if you can imagine the map, this doesn't only hand over Iraq. It hands over the whole Mashriq. you have Iran, Iraq, Syria, under a regime close to Iran, Lebanon, very much under the auspices of the Shiite militia Hezbollah, which is Iran's proxy, and you've got an Iranian sphere of influence from Tehran to the Mediterranean. This never existed at any time in the modern era. So the region has changed. And even though the Shia are still by far the minority, the Sunnis are the majority, the balance of power between Sunnah and Shia has changed dramatically in the last few decades, perhaps more dramatically than at any other time since the advent of Islam in the 7th century. This obviously was not the intention of the United States. But history is all about the unintended consequences. Nothing new about that. And the Americans clearly were not quite fully aware of what it was that they were doing. And the end result is dramatically changing the region. So what does this mean for Israel? Iran for Israel is a major challenge. The Iranians do not hide the fact that they see Israel as a mortal enemy. Israel was close to the old regime in Iran, the regime of the Shah. So the regime of the Ayatollah see Israel automatically on the list of enemies together with the United States. And if the Iranians repeatedly publicly speak about death to Israel and they try to build a nuclear capability, the Israelis see that as a direct threat to their very existence. And nothing odd about that. So on the one hand, Iran is the new threat. The Arabs, Israel hasn't fought an Arab state for 46 years. Just think of it. Israel has not gone to war with an Arab state since 1973. It has fought Palestinians in Lebanon. It has fought against Hezbollah in Lebanon. But Israel has not fought an all-out war against an Arab state for 46 years. The Arab-Israeli conflict, not the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the overall Arab-Israeli conflict basically is over. And the key Arab states that were involved in that conflict with Israel have made peace with Israel. Egypt has a peace with Israel for 40 years now. Jordan has peace with Israel for 25 years. Syria has no peace with Israel, but Syria is out of the equation for the foreseeable future. So Iran is unquestionably this cause for Israeli anxiety. But it's not only cause for Israeli anxiety. It is cause for the anxiety of the Sunni Arab states also, who see Iran as this rising threat. And in their hour of weakness and decline, they are not capable of facing Iran as equals. So the Sunni camp of anxious states looks to Israel for support. Looks to Israel as a potential ally versus Iran. Israel is no longer isolated in the Middle East by itself against everybody else. That was once the case. Gone. Maybe gone forever. Israel has Sunni Arab allies, much of which in this alliance is under the table, not out there in the open, but very real. And Israelis, including senior Israeli officials, Israeli sports delegations, are out there in the Gulf almost now as a matter of course. The question that does arise in reference to Iran does Israel, in this need to contend with the Iranian challenge, which is very serious, and I would say the challenge is not so much in the belief in Israel that the Iranians one day will have a nuclear bomb and will drop it on Tel Aviv. It's more subtle. Israel has serious challenges from non-state actors in the neighboring countries, particularly Hezbollah, which is an Iranian proxy, with tens of thousands of missiles trained on targets in Israel, and the Hezbollah is intensively engaged now in upgrading their precision with GPS, etc. They can do a lot of damage to Israel. If Iran becomes nuclear, will Israel be able to operate against Hezbollah freely when it needs to, if attacked by Hezbollah? With the fear that Iran is out there as the supporter of this proxy with a nuclear capability? Wouldn't this constrain Israel's ability to defend itself? This, for the Israelis, is a serious, serious challenge. The question I ask, however, is not whether Iran is a serious challenge to Israel. No question about that. Is the military or other punitive approaches, sanctions, etc., the only avenue to pursue? Isn't there perhaps a diplomatic option that should accompany the big stick, not just the big stick? And maybe there are alternative ways of dealing with this that don't lead in the long run to an all-out confrontation. I mentioned the non-presence of the Arabs in Syria. But a word about those who are present, and above all, Russia. Russia is back, and Russia is back to stay. This is not a brief interlude. The Russians intervened in Syria and decided the fate of the civil war in Syria. Assad was about to lose. And the Russians intervened in 2015 and saved him. Why did they do it? There are three main reasons why the Russians did what they did. And this I link the growing Russian intervention to a greater measure of American retreat. A growing Russian presence as the American footprint is cut down. Russia wants to be a great power again, and therefore behaving as a great power in the Middle East. Secondly, they have bases in Syria which they want to preserve. It's connected to the first point of projecting their power in the Eastern Mediterranean. And the third factor is Islamic politics. The Russians have an Islamic political problem of their own, domestically, the Chechen issue. The last thing the Russians want to see is some kind of ISIS running Syria, which would have a very negative influence on the Chechens in Russia and the impact on Russian domestic politics. The second most spoken language in ISIS, second to Arabic, was Russian, Chechens. And at present, Russia and Iran do have the upper hand in Syria. This is a major problem for Israel, although there are certain cracks in the relationship between Russia and Iran. On the one hand, Iran has built itself up in Syria as a neighbor to Israel, a very unpleasant neighbor as far as Israel is concerned. But Russia and Iran are not entirely on the same page in reference to Syria. The Russians want Syria to stabilize, and the Iranian presence is actually destabilizing. So there is some gap between the Iranians and the Russians, and I think Israel manages itself in this crack between them fairly well in keeping the Iranians at bay in establishing themselves in Syria. A word about two other matters. In this new Middle East, what should Israel do about the Palestinians? Many in Israel today would say the international community is not very concerned about the Palestinians. Even the Arabs don't care about the Palestinians that much. The Arabs are much more concerned about Iranian regional expansionism rather than the Palestinian issue. But I would argue that no matter what the international community may think of the Palestinian question, no matter how low the Palestinians may be on the international agenda or even on the Arab agenda, the Palestinians are a problem for Israel irrespective of what the international community may think. And Israel has to deal with the question of the Palestinians no matter what the level of concern is in Western Europe or Southeast Asia. In the territorial unit of what was British Mandatory Palestine, the area from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River, there are more or less 6.5 million Palestinians and an equal number of Jews. If Israel seeks to maintain itself as the nation state of the Jewish people and as a democracy, it has a problem that it has to address somehow, irrespective of what the international community may think of the problem. The problem here is, and it's not necessarily a lack of goodwill on both sides, although there is a huge amount of mutual mistrust. How is it that Israel has made real peace with countries like Egypt and Jordan, and yet with the Palestinians it's stuck in some immobile reality which isn't going anywhere? The reason is embedded in the historical evolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict. We fought two critical wars. 1948, Israel's War of Independence, and then the War of 1967, where Israel occupied the West Bank and the Golan and Gaza and Sinai with the Arab states. Peace was based on resolving the questions of 1967. That is, if you return the territory Israel took from Egypt in 1967, you can have a peace treaty with Egypt. Israel nearly did the same with Syria. With the Palestinians, it's not just 1967. It's not just a question of the West Bank and Gaza. With the Palestinians, key issues that have to be deliberated are Israel's creation in the first place. 1948. The question of the 1948 refugees. And this is where Israel and the Palestinian negotiation has a character of its own, which makes it far more difficult to resolve. Because this leads to a clash between the very foundation narratives of both parties. The Palestinians have a fundamental grievance, not with the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, which is also a grievance, but they have a fundamental grievance with Israel's creation in the first place. And Israel cannot negotiate its creation. And it creates issues that are politically virtually insoluble. So we're not locked in this immobility for it's a lack of goodwill on both parties. It's the very structure of the Israeli-Palestinian confrontation. That doesn't mean that there is nothing that can be done. And I think plenty can be done, short of solving all the historical problems between Israel and the Palestinians. But a lot can be done to diffuse the issue between Israel and the Palestinians, which has not been done. And I will conclude with one last comment. And that is, even though I myself use this term Middle East, I must say, and here for you, this is no great innovation, the term Middle East is way out of date. And here, you in India don't use it anyway. I mean, you call it West Asia, which is much more correct than what we in the region, we ourselves do. And strangely enough, all the peoples of the Middle East use this term. In Hebrew, we call it the Middle East. In Arabic, they call it the Middle East. In Turkish, they call it the Middle East. We all call it the Middle East. And for us, in the Middle East, it's not the middle or the east of anything, if you look at it from Tel Aviv. The Middle East is a name created by people who looked at the region in London. For them, it was the Middle East, as opposed to the Far East. The term Middle East was created in 1902, and it has to do with British imperial policy. The Middle East was the passage to India, and it therefore became this Arab world that the British had to control to secure the passage to India. That's where the term comes from. Long past, we shouldn't be using it. It doesn't make sense anymore. What does Algeria have to do with Kuwait? The fact that they all speak Arabic is about as relevant as it is that all the people in South America speak Spanish. So what? There are 4 regions in the so-called Middle East. There is North Africa, there is the Eastern Mediterranean, there is the Levant, and there is the Gulf. Israel is part of the Eastern Mediterranean, much more than it is part of this fictitious Middle East. And Israel has more in common with countries like Greece and Cyprus, non-Arab, non-Muslim, than it has with Iraq. And if you look at Israeli foreign policy today, it's much more closely related to the countries of the Eastern Mediterranean. Egypt, we have a peace treaty. In Greece and in Cyprus, the Israeli military train regularly. And the Israeli military is not going to train in Syria or in Iraq, that's for sure. We have a relationship with Greece and Cyprus which has certain strategic common interests, accelerated now because of our common hostility towards Turkey. In some ideal time, maybe it would have been a good thing to have Turkey part of this Eastern Mediterranean, but that's not going to be. Turkey has become something else, and maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A. The Turkish-Israeli relationship that seemed to be flourishing in the 1990s is off the charts for the moment, and I think for the foreseeable future. Turkey is going in a different direction. But Israel is, I would say, much more part of this Eastern Mediterranean and should be looked at as a country of the Eastern Mediterranean rather than this amorphous Middle East, which is a term which I think is of little analytical validity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, professors. That was a very enlightening explanation on the Middle East and the current going-ons. I was hoping to ask you a couple of questions before we open the floor to questions from the audience. And one of the things that I did want to ask you was on interests and interests of different countries. As you've explained, the expansionist or regional expansionist policy of Iran is quite evident. Why they have this issue exactly on Israel, I really can't understand. I don't know what the relevance of it is, especially given the fact that they are a centralized Shia caliphate which has an identity of its own and really doesn't need to pull on different pulls and tactics to draw people in. And how does that actually play with the Sunni role of Turkey and Saudi Arabia, maybe? If you could just explain the different interests of regions, and shouldn't they be changing going forward?
Well, I think what drives the Iranians, I would say 2 things. Firstly, the regime that came to power in 1979, the regime of the Ayatollahs, on the ruins of the regime of the Shah, overthrew a regime that was very friendly to Israel and also very friendly to the United States. Therefore, the regime of the Ayatollahs from day one in their seat of government in Tehran saw the United States and Israel as potential enemies of the regime. And they do see Israel far more than I think they ought to, but they do see Israel as this cat's paw of American hostility towards the regime, and that the United States and Israel are at least suspect of seeking to overthrow the regime. So the regime sees them as mortal enemies. This has a certain historical foundation which has nothing to do with either the United States or Israel. And that is, for very long years in the latter part of the 19th century, in the early part of the 20th century, Iran was a country beset by foreign intervention and influence. In the decade before the First World War, Iran was divided into spheres of influence. The British coming up from India in the south, the Russians coming down from Russia in the north, and Iran was a country that barely maintained its independent character. There were times when the British were very influential in deciding who ruled in Tehran, and there were times when the United States determined who ruled in Tehran. The Iranians are extremely susceptible to a paranoid vision of foreign policy. And therefore are very suspicious perhaps of countries they ought not to be, but they are. So Israel is very high up on their list of potential enemies, and they have singled Israel out and speak the way they do about Israel, which then creates an Israeli response to what it is that they are suggesting. And the two countries are, I would say, jacking up the hostility between them by their mutual recriminations, which go on and are part of the scenery, both extremely distrustful of the intentions of the other.
Okay. Before I come to India and its interaction with countries in the region, you brought up the United States and how the overthrow of Saddam may have led to the current situation that we're in. The current administration in the United States seems to be very favorably inclined towards Israel in terms of moving its embassy to Jerusalem, as well as acknowledging the Golan Heights as to be part of Israel. But if history shows me as a novice of history anything, that the US has always been wrong in its foreign policy in a majority of areas. Are the Israelis afraid of an excessive amount of US interference, I would say, in the region? And really, what is the outcome of Jared Kushner and his Gulf plan?
Well, I think the present Israeli government is very much in tune with the US administration, and I think they appreciate very much what the US is doing, both in terms of containing Iran and the gestures on Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, which I must emphasize. These gestures are exactly that. I mean, gestures. They don't really change anything. It's not as if Israel was about to give up the Golan Heights or Jerusalem, for that matter. So I don't think it really changes much, and the impact has not been that serious. I think the people in the region realize that this is a symbolism which doesn't carry much, let's say, historical weight. But where I think the problem for Israel does exist and may arise in the future, and this I think is more important for Israel. Israel was for decades a bipartisan issue in the United States. That is, Israel was an issue that was agreed between the Democrats and the Republicans. And Democrats and Republicans were equally supportive of Israel, more or less. At times, even the Democrats were a little bit more supportive of Israel than the Republicans. But basically, Israel for decades succeeded in managing its affairs in the US as a bipartisan issue. Israel is no longer a bipartisan issue. Israel has become an issue strongly supported by the Republicans, and amongst the Democrats, support for Israel is declining. This has a lot to do with the polarization of American politics. And I think Israel hasn't managed its affairs in the United States perhaps as masterfully as it could have by taking Trump's side so clearly. Israel is probably the most favored supporter of Trump in the entire universe. Has created a certain hostility between the Democrats and Trump and the Democrats and Israel. By challenging Obama's policy on Iran, publicly making a speech in Congress, taking the Democrats on, Netanyahu put Israel very firmly in the camp of the Republicans. Trump is only going to be the president of the United States for another 2 years or for another 6 years. That's the most it can possibly be. Someone will succeed Trump. What then? So I think these issues, Israel, the Republicans, the Democrats, the Golan, Jerusalem, has more to do with Israeli-American relations in the longer-term future than it has to do with shaping the Middle East of today.
Right. As we sit in India today, there's a palpable recognition that the relationship between India and Israel has truly gone to newer heights, and it continues to do so every year, and I think quite irreversibly so. The current administration may be more inclined, but I don't think any other political party would want to reverse that. But India does also have historical linkages with Iran, who considers Israel to be its mortal enemy. As well as with the Middle East, with the Gulf states of the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And we tend to play a very careful line. How is this viewed in Israel? Is this something that's accepted as a reality, that we have to play with everyone and have separate relationships and keep those separate? Because as I remember, when Prime Minister Modi visited Israel in 2017, there was news from Iran that the Muslim Kashmiris should stand up against oppressors without really naming the state. So, could there be a reaction to engaging deeper with Israel in India?
Well, I think Israel is fully aware and always has been aware. I remember having many conversations with one of the former ambassadors of India in Israel about Iran. I mean, many years ago. I mean, Israel and India have not been on the same page vis-a-vis Iran for a very long time. And I think both countries, both Iran and Israel, have put this aside. They have left this out of the equation in their bilateral relationship. Israel does not complain about Iran to India, and India doesn't complain to Israel about its policies towards Iran. We have simply left it out. We disagree, but we have, I think both countries have decided not to make an issue of it, and we've left it at that. For Israel, the breakthrough with India is of such historical consequence that I cannot imagine a situation where Israel would allow the difference over Iran to affect that relationship.
But what underlies that relation? Is it economic? Is it the fact that India has a large Muslim population and could reflect that peace in a different manner in the region, in the Middle East or the far West Asia?
I think it has much more to do with first of all, the economics, the science-technology relationship that puts these two countries together. What Israel has to offer Iran, Israel has to offer India, and what India has to offer Israel, in terms of security cooperation, security know-how. You deal with problems that are very similar to our problems. You have hostilities in the region that are very similar to the hostilities that we have. There's a lot in common. India is such a crucial player in the international arena that for Israel to have an important relationship with India is a revolution in Israeli foreign policy. Israel used to be very restricted in its foreign relations. For Israel to have relations with a country like India, on the level that Israel has, with a country of the regional and international importance of India, for Israel is one of the most important developments in Israeli foreign policy since 1948. I would say it is second only to Israel's relationship with the United States and the European Union. Then comes India, which didn't exist almost at all until the 1990s. So this for Israel is so critically important that I cannot imagine. That is why I think the Iranian issue, Israel complains about the Iranian issue to the Europeans and complains about European policy vis-a-vis Iran much more than it complains about India. Even though Israel's major trading partner is the European Union. And I think this is related directly to the critical importance, political, geostrategic, symbolic of Israel's relations with India and what that means for Israel in Asia. That is, I would say, more important than anything that divides the two on even an important country like Iran.
Wonderful. Professor Sosa, what gives you hope about the future? What is going to resolve some of the conflicts? And actually, where do you see this West Asia region in 50 years?
Well,
I mean, you talked about the fear of the catastrophe of demographics that is currently in West Asia, but of course, per capita income should rise, education levels should rise. And if you have some of those institutions which are in place, which I'm sure are being worked upon, you should see better women rights. Where would you see this West Asia?
I'll tell you what the problem is that you said that there should be
better education, and there should be improved women's rights. The problem is that this is not happening. Demography, the demographic changes are still, population growth is much too fast for the region to be able to sustain. Looking ahead is looks rather bleak, I must say. You mentioned previously, and I'll link it to what we're talking about now, Jared Kushner's plan for what they call the deal of the century. I don't think what the Trump administration is coming forth with, the so-called deal of the century, is going to be anything remotely similar to any deal of any century. Not much is going to come of this. The Arabs are already up in arms against it before it's even been published. And I think if I look at how things are emerging, the region in great difficulty, and I think in increasing difficulty in the foreseeable future. 50 years is, very far down the road. I hesitate to speak about that far down the road. Israel is successful. Israel is more relatively powerful than it has been ever since its creation in comparison to the neighborhood. We operated for decades in the first years of Israel under the wrong assumption that the Arab states were bound to increase in their power and to pose a threat to Israel that would eventually become unsustainable from our point of view. They're too big, too potentially powerful, too populous. They will build these massive armies, align themselves with the Soviet Union, and pose a military threat to Israel that Israel, with then 2.5, 3, 4 million people, won't be able to face the music. So Israel developed a nuclear project of its own. Out of this very pessimistic view of the balance of power between Israel and the Arabs. But what emerged was the reverse. Instead of the Arabs getting stronger and stronger, and Israel getting weaker and weaker in comparison, Israel has got much stronger and stronger, and the Arabs have got weaker and weaker. Israel is now challenged, not by the power of the Arabs, but by their weakness, which creates a region which is completely unstable, unpredictable, problematic, non-state actors which are very difficult to deal with. But what that also means, that Israel is in a position to make critical decisions that will affect its place in the region by itself. I mean, after all, if you look at this from the ideological point of view, from what it is that Israel is all about. I mean, why did we create Israel? The Jews, if you look at where, by the way, this week in Israel, starting from tomorrow to the 9th of May, is the week between the Day of Remembrance for the Holocaust to Israel's celebration of independence. That week is the encapsulation of the Israeli mega-narrative. That is what Israel is. This emergence from being the downtrodden of the earth to being a sovereign power capable of determining the fate of the Jewish people. We are now in that position. We can really do it. We can really make the great decisions. And I would say, I don't think we can solve the problems of the Middle East. But we should make, and we can make, decisions that affect our relationship with the Palestinians, that have an effect on our immediate surroundings, Israel, the West Bank, Israel, Gaza, Israel, Jordan. The immediate vicinity is something that Israel could shape more than it does through the policies that are too passive in my mind, and with not enough Israeli initiative. We cannot solve the problems of Egypt. And we won't be able to solve the problems of the rest of the Middle East. But we can make Israel and its immediate surroundings more stable and more palatable. And I think that is something that Israeli initiative should take upon itself.
Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, we have run out of time. There were 3 questions here. If I could request you to take it offline with Professor Sousa after this talk. But thank you very much for your time. And ladies and gentlemen, you must agree with me by saying that this has been a most enlightening talk by Professor Sousa. Please do join me in congratulating him and thanking him for his time. Thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing you back in India soon with the photo.
I hope so. I look forward to coming back.
Thank you so much. That was truly wonderful.
Thank you.